Hello friends, welcome to Current Jobs. Today we'll be discussing about banking and whatever has happened in the past year about banking in India. Now I am Ayush Agarwal, I am economics faculty at Manifest IAS. Now coming to the strategy talk for this lecture, that is how to prepare for government programs, policies and schemes. See, as we know, government programs and policies are a major component of prelims. So how to handle them, how to prepare for them, and how to be ready for any question which UPSC asks. So I'll be answering this question at the end of the video. Now coming to the banking, so we'll be discussing about Bimal Jalan Committee, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, Asset Reconstruction Companies, Yes Bank and its 81 bond crisis, merger of banks, etc. in this video.
Subscribe now and press the bell icon. Never miss an update.
Now coming to Bimal Jalan Committee, first of all, Bimal Jalan Committee was appointed to mediate between RBI and the government regarding the transfer of surplus capital with the RBI. So we can say Bimal Jalan Committee is a committee on capital framework of the RBI. So government and RBI had a dispute with respect to surplus transfer or dividend from RBI. The contingency reserves held by RBI were roughly 28% versus a global average of 14%. So therefore the government requested or government insisted that RBI has room for surplus and maybe the RBI can transfer the surplus dividends to tide over the current economic slowdown, or the current fiscal situation can be managed by contingency reserve transfer from government to the government. Now RBI deemed it as necessary to maintain high levels of capital reserves due to financial risk and operational risk in India. Now financial risk being that there are a lot of NPAs in India in the banking sector, and operational risk being that there are a lot of trade uncertainties such as US-China trade war, FIIs, etc. So operational is about global level, financial is about the internal level or the strength of the banking sector and NBFC sector in India. So RBI Act under Section 7, government may issue guidelines to RBI. So this became the Section 7 under RBI Act under which government issued guidelines. So guidelines were about surplus transfer. So this became a bone of contention between RBI and the government. And ultimately it led to resignations also of the former RBI governor, which is Urjit Patel. So this became a problem. So the government of India appointed Bimal Jalan Committee to suggest a suitable framework to make it apolitical or to make it scientific in nature. So what does this Bimal Jalan Committee say? It is reviewing the RBI's economic capital framework. Second, the economic capital framework provides a methodology for determining the appropriate level of risk, provision and profit distribution under Section 47. So Section 7 is the guideline. Section 47 is the distribution of the profits to government. Third is, framework has to be reviewed every 5 years. But if there is a change in RBI risk and operating environment, for example, now coronavirus is there, so maybe there is a change in the risk and operating environment. So an intermediate review may be considered. Lastly, the panel recommended to align the central bank's accounting year with the financial year of the government so that there is consistency in the dividend payment. See, as we know, the RBI's financial year is from January to December and the government's financial year is from 1st April to 31st March. So if we align those two, we'll have a better coordination between fiscal policy and monetary policy and also about the surplus transfer. So RBI should put in place a framework for assessing the market risk of its off-balance sheet exposures in view of this increasing significance. So off-balance sheet here means that the exposure which is beyond the RBI's mandatory exposures such as CRR, SLR and foreign securities. So it buys government bonds, it buys other things. So off-balance sheet exposure has to be limited. So what is economic capital? Economic capital is simply its capital or basically the reserves of money plus the extra reserves it has, risk provisions and revaluation balances. So revaluation balances are simply put, for example, when RBI sells foreign exchange. So it might have bought that foreign exchange at 60 rupees, but at the time of selling the value of the dollar might be 70 rupees. So revaluation balance here is 10 rupees because the purchase price is 60 and the selling price is 70. So because of revaluation alone, the economic capital increased by 10 rupees. So therefore, its capital reserves risk provision same way. If there is a fear of a bank collapse, the RBI has to rescue the bank or it has to provide some risk cover. So 10 rupees has to be reserved for risk. So similarly, revaluation and risk can be counterbalanced. So capital reserves risk and revaluation form what we call economic capital, where revaluation balances are unrealized gains, net losses resulting from movement of exchange rate, gold price, or interest rate. See, for example, when RBI builds up its reserves, so it might have bought them at 50 rupees, but today the rate is 70 rupees. But RBI has not necessarily sold all the dollars. So 20 rupees is in the books, but it is not realized. Only when it is realized, we can say the revaluation balances have been realized. Right now, they are unrealized, they are just showing the book value. Note that revaluation balances are the major component of RBI's economic capital. So basically, revaluation balances form 73% of total economic capital, and mind it is unrealized. So clearly, distinction between two components of economic capital, that is realized and revaluation, is necessary to curb the volatility in the economic capital. The committee recommended that the minimum level of realized equity to be maintained should be the sum of monetary and financial stability risk, credit risk, and operational risk. So monetary and financial stability is what we say main function of RBI. Credit risk is about NPAs, and operational risk is what we talked about, the international operating environment, about global liquidity, FIIs, etc. The central bank is exposed to different type of risk. For example, first is market risk arising out of currency, gold, or interest rate fluctuations. Second, credit risk about NPAs. Third, operational risk about multi-currency portfolios because US dollar, pound, US-China trade war, those are the operational risks. And lastly, contingency risk, which is about bank collapse or emergency funding, which is required to maintain monetary and financial stability. If the realized equity is above the required level, the entire net income of RBI will be transferred to the government. So it's very important that if realized equity is above the risk thresholds, RBI can transfer the entire surplus to the government of India. So what is the position? Contingency fund was roughly in 2018 2.32 lakh crores. Currency and gold revaluation was 6.92 lakh crore. Asset development fund, investment realization, so total reserves were roughly 9.6 lakh crore. So how does the RBI build its reserves? RBI earns interest, it gets fees, it has some investment in foreign currencies. So therefore, the record surplus was transferred to the government because the Demil-Jalan committee thought that whatever is required, the required capital, whatever the surplus is, has to be transferred to the government, and also the revaluation balances have to be taken into account. Now coming to the next theme, which is Utkarsh 2022. Utkarsh 22 is nothing but a 3-year roadmap to improve regulation and supervision by RBI to ensure the stability of the financial system in India. So it's a medium-term strategy in line with the global central bank's plan to strengthen the regulatory and supervisory mechanism, for example, Basel III norms, etc. This specifically includes the central bank's proactive role to avoid any ILFS debt default issues in future. Because Utkarsh goes beyond the banking system, it goes to financial services, NBFCs, urban cooperative banks also. Now coming to the next important pillar, which is IBC, or Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Under this, first of all, Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code Second Amendment Bill 2019 was passed, where it talked about the rights of home buyers, but it is discriminatory as it does not treat home buyers on par with financial creditors, which is in a way violating a Supreme Court ruling itself. So a threshold of 100 home buyers or 10% of home buyers is in a regional project, whichever is less, as a requirement to jointly take the developer to an insolvency court. So this itself is making it discriminatory, because according to Supreme Court, even one home buyer should be treated as a financial creditor and should be able to take the developer to the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. Lastly, that individual home buyer who is a financial creditor cannot solve for cannot file for insolvency application. So no criminal proceedings against those who buy out a bankrupt company, and no tax claim would be raised against them after implementation of a resolution plan. So that means the builders can get away with criminal proceedings, they can get away with no tax claims if a resolution plan is admitted against them. Now, the next important pillar in solving the NPA problem in India is inter-creditor agreement. This is simply but all lenders may decide to resolve NPAs on their own for small borrowers and MSMEs. So there is no need to go for IBC or court. They can decide on their own and they can expedite the process of recoveries. Secondly, this is an alternative mechanism along with the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Third, the intercreditor agreement or the ICA, that is a direct result of the government's Shashakt resolution plan or report on bad loan drafted by the Sunil Mehta committee. NBFCs and ARC or non-bank finance companies or asset reconstruction companies are mandated to join the intercreditor agreement. So what is this about? All lenders enter into an intercreditor agreement for implementation of a resolution plan for small borrowers and MSME. Secondly, it provides for decision agreed by lenders with 75% majority. So this is very important. ICA is passed only if 75% of majority voting is there, which is 75% of the value of total outstanding loan, or 60% of lenders by number shall be binding upon all the lenders. Lenders to undertake prima facie review of borrower account within 30 days. So they have to decide within 30 days whether this process is for them or not. Lastly, it has to be implemented within 180 days. It should not carry on forever because this plan is supposed to expedite the NPA resolution. So the maximum time given is 6 months. Lastly, if the 180 days requirement is not followed, then there are additional provisions such as 20% and another 15% if you delay further. So this makes it more expensive for the banks to maintain the bad loans in their books because they have to provide extra provisions for the bad loan. And lastly, lenders may choose to initiate legal proceedings for insolvency or recovery in case they find that this is not working on the expected lines. The additional provision should be reversed if resolution is pursued under IBC. So simply this means that even after intercreditor agreement, if they decide to send the case to insolvency and bankruptcy court, the additional provision, which is of 20% and 15% as we see in the first point, would not be required. Now, what are these asset reconstruction companies or ARCs? See, ARCs are simply companies which specialize in bad debts. So they buy up NPAs or bad assets from banks and financial institutions in order to clean their balance sheets or in order to restructure them. So that's why asset reconstruction. So there's a bad asset. So bad asset is simply bad loan, which is we call bad asset or non-performing asset, and how to clean them up, how to get it working again. That is why we call it asset reconstruction. Bad asset being reconstructed. So asset reconstruction companies, so that we are able to recover the bad loans. So RBI has recently allowed ARCs to buy financial assets from its peers or other ARCs. So that was a very big news that ARCs were not allowed to buy assets from other ARCs before, but now ARC exit problem has been solved by putting in this provision of allowing ARCs to buy financial assets from peers. Lastly, all such transactions have to be settled in cash because already this is a debt instrument. You are already buying a bad loan, so you cannot take more loans to finance a bad loan. So that will create a even more danger to the financial stability. So all such transactions have to be settled in cash. Next, amendment to the Sarfazi Act has to be passed to enable this transactions to happen. Selling ARC must utilize the proceeds so received for the redemption of underlying security receipts. See, underlying here means the guarantees against which the ARC has bought that bad assets. And lastly, the date of redemption of underlying security receipts and total realization should not extend beyond 8 years from the date of acquisition. So basically, the ARC can sell those assets which are younger than 8 years from the date of buying from the bank. Now coming to the important issue, which is Yes Bank and the issue of AT1 bonds or Tier 1 capital. So Yes Bank issue was a issue which disturbed the entire private sector banks and it shook up the banking sector, and it also led to many problems for depositors, moratorium, etc. So what was the issue about? Firstly, on the advice of RBI, the government imposed a moratorium on Yes Bank. The important thing to note here is RBI did not put a moratorium. On the advice of the RBI, the government imposed a moratorium on Yes Bank. So this will become very important for prelims, because usually there's a confusion between what is the role of RBI here, what is the role of government here. So the moratorium was imposed by the government on the advice of the RBI. So RBI proposed a reconstruction scheme under which SBI would take a share of 49% in the bank in order to turn it around or restructure it. Next, the investor bank or SBI will not be able to reduce its stake below 26% for a period of 3 years. A steady decline in Yes Bank's financial position, mainly due to lenders' inability to raise adequate capital. Now, this capital is a requirement under Basel II and Basel III norms, where each bank is required to have some capital reserves for tier 1, tier 2, or in order to service bad loans. So Yes Bank problem was that it was not able to retain sufficient capital with itself in order to make provisions for NPAs. So, and lastly, various highlights of corporate governance lapses came to light. So, what was the issue? Additional tier 1 bonds, or AT1 bonds as they are called, were issued by Yes Bank, which were totaling 11,000 crores. So RBI said whatever these AT1 bonds are, so AT1 bonds we will be coming to later, which are unsecured loans, so shall be written down permanently in full with effect from appointment date. That means that RBI has said in order to restructure the bank, these 11,000 crore raised from the market will not be returned by Yes Bank to the investors. So apart from mutual funds, pension funds, institutional investors, HNIs also invest in these AT1 bonds. So AT1 bonds, are also known as additional tier 1 bonds, are unsecured. I repeat, unsecured. That's why it's not necessary to pay back those 11,000 crores. Perpetual bonds. Perpetual means that they're everlasting. They'll not have a maturity date. So what they do is they recycle. For example, if you want your money back, they'll give you 10,000 rupees, but at the same time, they'll issue fresh loans of, or fresh tier 1 bond of 10,000 rupees, so that the amount remains the same and it remains perpetual. And these are issued to meet Basel III requirements. So Basel III norms were a set of rules that banking regulators around the world came up with after the global financial crisis in 2008 to strengthen the bank balance sheets. So roughly they include so-called CAMELS. CAMELS is CAMELS, or capital adequacy, asset quality, management, earnings, liquidity, systems control. So CAMELS, I repeat, capital adequacy, asset quality, management, earnings, liquidity, and systems control. So under that, capital adequacy is the first point which is required to raise capital under Basel III norms. So RBI's version of Basel III norms require Indian banks to hold a minimum capital amount to 11.5% of their risk-weighted loans. So AT1 bonds are issued by banks to supplement their permanent or tier 1 capital, which is mainly made of equity shares. So which is equity shares of the owner of the bank or the shares issued in the stock market, etc. Lastly, AT1 bonds are supposed to remain permanently with the bank and pay investors interest for the perpetuity or the time for which they are investing their money in the bank. So they have a call option after 5 or 10 years that banks use to retire one set of AT bonds and issue another. So after 5 years, if you want to withdraw 10,000, they'll issue a fresh one of 10,000 so that the bond remains perpetual, but the investor gets back the money after 5 years or 10-year intervals. So Indian banks have so far never failed to call back their AT1 bonds after 5 or 10 years. So this has led to the so-called perpetual title in the AT1 bonds. That means nobody has ever cashed them out. Next, the contract terms for AT1 bonds clearly mention that the value of these bonds can be completely written off if the central bank's capital ratios fall below the regulatory threshold. So here regulatory threshold under Basel norms is 11.5%. So if Yes Bank's capital falls below 11.5%, these bonds can be completely written off or can be said to be zero money making or completely loss for the people who have invested in these bonds. The write-off also kicks in if the RBI decides that the bank is beyond the point of non-viability. So non-viability here means that the bank is not in a situation to function according to the needs of the depositors. So what is the viability for a commercial bank in India according to RBI Act? That this commercial bank must always be acting in the interest of its depositors. And lastly, only affluent investors who are willing to take on higher risk of a capital loss, they invest in these bonds because high risk comes with high interest and higher yields as well. So bonds can partly or fully skip their interest payments for any year if the bank's tier 1 capital ratios fall below the RBI threshold. So therefore, Yes Bank can refuse the interest payouts as well. So banks can also reduce the principal value of the bonds temporarily or for good or zero if the tier 1 ratio falls below specified limits. And lastly, RBI can decide on a complete write down on AT1 bonds and convert them into equity if it feels that it has reached the point of non-viability. So retail investors were sold these high value bonds. The face value is 10 lakh. So 10 lakh is not a small amount. So because they were offering high returns, more than it was offering roughly 2 to 3% higher than your normal fixed deposits. So some investors also bought them through their brokers based on their high yields in the secondary market. So here primary market is what Yes Bank sells. Secondary market is where some other investors sell to somebody else. For example, Bombay Stock Exchange, NSE, etc. so-called secondary markets. Now coming to the next issue, which is bank mergers. So recently we had various mergers where 10 public sector banks were merged into 4 banks. The anchor banks for this merger were PNB, Canara Bank, UBI and Indian Bank. So this was first proposed by Narasimhan Committee in 1991, where it proposed a 3-tier banking structure with 3 large banks with international presence, 8 to 10 nationalized banks, and a large number of regional and local banks at the bottom. Further, PJ Nayak Committee in 2014 suggested that the government should privatize or merge some public sector banks. And lastly, in 2017, government had constituted an alternative mechanism panel headed by Ministry of Finance and Corporate Affairs to look into the merger proposals of public sector banks. So, and this has also been carried out after successful mergers of SBI and Bank of Baroda with Vijaya Bank, etc. So this is a few chart which you can have a look later about what will be the value of the bank and what is the size of the bank. For example, PNB will become the second largest bank in India. So if you notice from this slide that there are anchor banks, there are amalgamating banks, they have change in the size of the banks in India. Secondly, for prelims, if we have 27 public sector banks in 2017, which will be now reduced to just 12. And if you see, technology platform or the core banking solution is the main consideration for the mergers. For example, PNB, OBC and UBI all use core banking solution which is given by Finacle. So this was a key criteria so that there is smooth merger of the banks in India. Now coming to cooperative banks, as we know that PMC Bank or Cooperative Bank was in news. So what are the regulations behind the Cooperative Bank and what has changed? Firstly, amendment to the Banking Regulation Act to bring 1540 cooperative banks under the direct regulation of RBI so that we don't have PMC-like scam in the future. Secondly, regulator gets power to supersede the board. For example, RBI can now supersede board of such banks so in order to check the books on time. Thirdly, administrative matters to continue under the Registrar Cooperative Societies Act. However, cooperative banks would be regulated under RBI's banking guidelines. So administratively, they are still under the Registrar of Cooperatives. They'll be regulated by RBI. So this is very important for prelims. Lastly, the auditing would also be done according to RBI norms for the financial sector. So what are the qualifications? Appointment of chief. The RBI will be deciding upon the qualification of the board. So appointment of chief executive officer. RBI's permission would be required for appointment to key positions so that there is no misuse of the cooperative bank. RBI will deal with issue of loan waivers. And lastly, deposit insurance cover will also be extended to these banks and it will be enhanced from rupees 1 lakh to rupees 5 lakh. So in case of a bank collapse, a depositor can claim an amount up to a maximum of 5 lakh, which was earlier 1 lakh per account as the insurance cover. So banks that come under your deposit insurance cover are all commercial banks, regional rural banks, and cooperative banks, except rural primary cooperative societies. So this is very important question for prelims, that who all will be getting this benefit of 5 lakh rupees insurance cover in case of bank failure or failure of the financial system, which is all commercial banks, regional rural banks, and cooperative banks, except rural primary cooperative societies. So this is very important for prelims this year. The insurance cover is provided by Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation. So what do the banks pay for this? So this is basically governed by the Deposit Insurance and Credit Guarantee Corporation Act 1961, which was issued in Parliament. And lastly, fully owned subsidiary of the RBI. So DIC charges 12 paisa per 100 of deposits held by a bank. So banks have to pay 12 paisa per 100 rupees to get this insurance done. Lastly, we'll come to FRDI bill, or Financial Regulation and Deposit Insurance Bill. So clearly defined triggers for prompt corrective action framework to bring problem institution into resolution. See a primary focus of a commercial bank to act in its interest of its depositors. So if it is going wrong, FRDI bill has to come and protect them. So one way is to be proactive and come up with the guidelines of PCA framework, or prompt corrective action framework, so that we can check the bank in its time. For example, a stitch in time saves 9. So where PCA framework will come into place to protect the interest of the depositor. So it covers parent institutions as well as subsidiaries, a lesson learned from ILFS, because ILFS crisis was mainly propagated from its subsidiaries. So FRDI bill will also be expanded to cover subsidiaries and the parent institution as well. Next, so it will provide for a resolution authority to protect the depositor. So what will this resolution authority do? It will restrict it to only orderly resolution, not to restoration and recovery. So it will come at a stage where we are trying to resolve the crisis as well, but it will not be bothered about restoration or recovery of the financial system. That is the duty of the RBI. It will have representation of all financial sector regulators, which is RBI, SEBI, pension fund, insurance regulator, central government, etc. So what would be the structure of this resolution authority? Each regulator will be tasked with creating a PCA framework for the institution under their ambit. For example, RBI will have its own guideline, SEBI similarly, PFRDA, IRDA, central government. The resolution fund, which will replace DICGC, or Deposit Insurance Credit Guarantee Corporation, will collect premium based on the risk-based assessment. So each body will assess the risk of the possibility of a collapse or possibility of trouble in that body, and they'll come up with the risk parameters. According to the risk parameters, the government will decide the bailout to provide liquidity. Here means to provide cash to the system, or to provide some form of relief or capital to support the interest of the depositors. So FSDR has removed the controversial bail-in provision. Basically, bail-in was that the bank was able to dip into the money held by depositors in the bank. So that has become a controversial thing. So FSDR removed the bail-in provision where the depositor's money itself was used for recovery of the institution. But now, as we see, a resolution fund will have to be set up, which is not depositor's money, to bail out the banking system. Now, what are the tools under FRDI? First is transferring the whole or part of the assets and liabilities to another entity. For example, simply ICICI Bank or HDFC Bank can be asked, or SBI can be asked to take over Yes Bank, which was the case recently, that SBI was told to participate in the equity of Yes Bank. Secondly, create a bridge service provider where some provisions, some entities of Yes Bank are simply taken over. For example, UPI handles of Yes Bank were transferred to ICICI Bank within 24 hours. Third, cancellation or modification of liabilities. For example, 81 bonds, as we discussed, were cancelled as liabilities by the RBI. Merger or amalgamation with other banks. Acquisition by another bank. For example, SBI taking over Yes Bank, or SBI being merged with Yes Bank, or Yes Bank being merged with SBI. However, this was not the case. We went for the first option, where some part of the asset was transferred to SBI in terms of Yes Bank. Next, liquidation, which is selling of the company in parts. Runoff in case of insurance company if deemed appropriate. Runoff is basically an insurance company liquidation process. And lastly, what is the time frame? Resolution has to be completed in 1 year, which is very important. It has to be completed in 1 year with the provision for an extension for an additional 1 year in exceptional cases. So decision of liquidation has to be cleared by NCLT. NCLT is National Company Law Tribunal, or a resolution authority or resolution professional will be appointed as a liquidator for the financial company. Now coming to the issue for the tip, which is simply that how to prepare for programs, policies and schemes for the exam. First of all, we should be very clear about the role of the program, policy or scheme. So for that, we need to do 2 or 3 things. First is we should be very clear who is the beneficiary of the scheme. For example, is it farmers? Is it farmers up to 2 acres? Is it a girl child? So first step is to know who is the beneficiary. Second is what is the benefit given under the scheme. So one must be very clear. Is it only health, or is it health plus nutrition, or is it health, nutrition and education, etc. Third is that who is doing it. For example, which department or under which ministry. So who is handling this? And fourth is the professional. Is it done through ASHA? Is it done through ANM? Or is there some functionary involved in this? And lastly, we have to be very careful about the center-state sharing ratios. That what is the role of the center, what is the role of the state, or in other words, what is the role of federalism in implementation of these schemes. And lastly, I would request you to go to the comment section and write your comments. It will help us in improving this series further. And also, we would request that you please give a feedback and solve the question as requested. Solve the question to gauge your performance for prelims. Thank you.